So welcome to the seminar series, Strengthening Democracy, Research Practice Exchange. The idea of the seminar series is basically to bridge the gap between research and practice, to make our research from our angle, of course, more impactful. And each episode of the series invites a researcher and a practitioner on a topic and puts them into conversation. So this series is hosted by the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. My name is Hans Asenbaum. I'm a senior research fellow here at the center. So in today's seminar, we look at the role of AI in democracy, and we raise the provocative question, dear ChatGPT, what is democracy? To see whether AI, generative AI, can make sense of democracy, whether it can help as a tool for democracy, but also whether it might even become a participant in democracy. And I think we all feel this moment in time, which is a moment of profound change. You might even want to call it an AI revolution. If we think back about when the internet became popular, when the World Wide Web became accessible to many people in the 1990s, a lot has changed since in how we communicate, how we structure our work, how productive we are, and how we live our social relations as well. And we're living a similar moment now, only I think it's going even faster. So we need to pay close attention to this moment, ask critical questions. And this is what this seminar today here is for. So before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Canberra is on the land of the Ngunnawal people. Sovereignty to this land has never been ceded. And I'd like to extend my respect to elders past and present, as well as to all First Nations people with us today. So I'm joined by two fantastic speakers, and I literally couldn't have wished for better speakers. I'm very glad that they both agreed to be with us today. I'll briefly introduce them and then we'll head into the conversation. So Reema Patel is an independent researcher and practitioner with expertise in deliberative and participatory democracy. So she has research background. She is in the Digital Good Network and Public Voices in AI, but she's also a practitioner and coming to us with her practitioner hat on today. She's director of Elgon Social, which is an agency for public engagement, research director of Ipsos, and a co-founder of the Ada Lovelace Institute. She currently works on she's currently the implementation lead of the Global Climate Citizens Assembly at Iswe Foundation and also an associate to the Wellcome Trust. So welcome, Reema. We see you're very accomplished, and I really appreciate that you're here with us today. So our speaker with the research hat on, so to speak, is James Muldoon. He's an associate professor in management at the Essex Business School, a research associate at the Oxford Internet Institute, and head of digital research at the think tank Autonomy. He's very prolific. I'm very impressed by all your work, James. I'm just going to point out the two more recent books that are very important to the topic that we're talking about today. James is the author of Platform Socialism, How to Reclaim Our Digital Future from Big Tech, and a co-author of Feeding the Machine, The Hidden Human Labor Powering AI. So a brief note that this session is being recorded, and you can find it along with all of our other sessions on the center's YouTube channel. So to kick off the conversation, Reema, I wanted to ask you a rather big question. Obviously, AI harbors a lot of potential for democracy, and deliberative participatory Democrats are getting excited about all the opportunities that are out there. If we think about citizens' assemblies, democratic innovations, how AI could serve as a tool to further these kind of democratic innovations. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the AI tools that are out there that are currently in use. but maybe also tell us a little bit about the risks, because we're all aware that AI harbors a lot of risks and dangers for democracy. So from your personal perspective, what would you say are the biggest dangers of AI for democracy?
Brilliant, thank you. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to be technology and tool centric in my response. What I'm going to do is talk about the potential uses and applications of AI and two different types of AI. So one relates to predictive uses of AI, the types of AI you see used in public services. And they're really kind of context-based and specific. So algorithms that try to realize a public service goal or outcome. And then there's generative AI, which I think there's definitely been a lot of hype around, where you have like large scale data sets and algorithms that are trained on these large scale data sets that are effectively acting to create new content or material and the framing of this event is very much around ChatGPT, which is an example of generative AI. Um, I like to sort of think about deliberative processes first and then kind of spell out the different ways in which something like these different applications of AI could be useful or valuable. And then I will turn to your question about risk. So the first thing is to say that the approach to technology should always be socio-technical. So we should always place the goals and the outcomes of deliberative democracy first when we're thinking about the use of AI, and some of those relate to, the democratic legitimacy, the political legitimacy of deliberative democratic processes. They relate very much to the kind of quality of deliberation, enabling people to feel like they have agency and empowerment, enabling people to change and shape outcomes. So I think these principles are worth bearing in mind when we're thinking about the use of AI and both opportunities and risks. In terms of the opportunities, I think there are many. So, for instance, AI can help people to think about how they are gathering, collating, analysing their own data in the context of a deliberative process. So I see there's real opportunity for members of the public to begin to lean into what tends to be very practitioner oriented around summarising and analysing data. And you can see how tools like ChatGPT could help with something like that. On the flip side, we don't actually know how ChatGPT works. We don't know what's happening to the data. In lots of ways, the model and the business model of something like ChatGPT is very anti-democratic. So there's obviously risks around the use of that data in the context of a business model like ChatGPT. The sort of interesting approaches to the uses of AI, so around thematic analysis as a deliberative process might convene. You could sort of almost see that iterative approach to analysis and research. And in the context of online deliberation, it's also worth pointing out that AI is being used in ways that we don't necessarily always recognize or realize that it is very much present. So, Zoom deliberations might have AI-enabled transcripts and summaries and so on. There's sort of interesting questions around the use of things like creative material, content, the sorts of presentations and the innovations that might be shared with members of a mini public, for instance. So, and that brings all sorts of interesting opportunities for engaging people who might not be familiar with the topic. But it also presents some challenges and risks around integrity and quality of the information and how you ensure that actually that's being reviewed by people who are specialists in a domain and how that adheres to the standards of deliberative democracy as well. And the sort of fine line between content that has actually been created and is sort of fictional versus content, the representational reality. And of course, there's sort of challenges and issues there when we're talking about and we're thinking about the sort of information that is presented to, say, a deliberative mini public. These are all quite practical sort of examples of how I think both AI is already being used in the context of a deliberation, its opportunities, but also some of its challenges and risks. The sort of I have seen tools that are end to end, so they sort of are now being developed to start with supporting a deliberation over a period of time and engaging people through a technology and then embedding things like deliberative polling and other types of mechanisms within the context. There are two really interesting resources I point people to. One is the Civic Tech Field Guide, which I'll drop a link to in the chat. And then the other is the people-powered digital democracy scorecard, and both have AI lists of AI technologies that are in alignment with the goals of the civic tech movement. Coming back to that point about the business model, I'm not sure really how long I should be talking for in response to this. It was quite a detailed response, but do give me a sort of sense as to when I need to keep my response shorter.
Yeah, maybe you want to get to the risks and then wrap up.
Yeah, I mean I spoke to the risks throughout my use of the examples of the use cases. I mean the risks are sort of around privacy, around safeguarding people's rights when it comes to their information about themselves. So obviously, some of us might be putting a lot of information about ourselves into these tools, and we don't actually know what's happening with that information. There's risks that relate to the impact on our critical thinking, which is, I think, a really interesting question. The goal of deliberative democracy is very much around enabling people to have well, one of the goals is very much about enabling people to, exercise their critical thinking capacity. And if that's the case, then actually there are some questions about the impact the use of AI technologies might have in such a context. So it's quite an interesting balance to strike as to whether AI technologies ultimately further these goals. Other risks, I already sort of highlighted the challenges around assurance and quality of information. Does it actually meet the standards required for deliberative democracy? Actually, I think there's a broader risk, which is that we all get very distracted by the technologies and we lose our eye on what we're doing, which is we are building models and mechanisms to enable deliberation. The hype in this space is quite strong. So how do we take quite a balanced approach to the use of AI technologies and a nuanced one that is quite considered is like an interesting question and challenge for us all to consider.
Great, Reema. Thank you so much. I think a lot of the risks that you've pointed to regarding AI is that we're often not aware of where it is present, what it does, and how it exactly works. I mean, just when I entered the Zoom platform, it says, AI, there's a AI companion on Zoom now transcribing. So a lot of it is happening in the background. So, James, I know you've been working on the materiality of AI. So the question of how the technology actually looks, how it feels, how it exists, and how we are often unaware of this. So we often engage with AI on these kind of like digital interfaces and only see the surface. So the big question is what is happening in the background? And I think in understanding AI technology, we can also enhance our democratic agency. In the book Feeding the Machine, you talk about AI as a human-powered, labor-intensive machine that costs a lot of blood and sweat, human blood and sweat. You talk about the colonial history of AI and the environmental impact. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about this human-powered machine and how an awareness of that might help us in democracy.
Yes, certainly. Well, thank you very much, Hans, and thank you, Reema, for that answer. In our book, what we're really trying to do is to show what is happening under the hood of AI, what is going on in the supply chains of AI. So it's not so much a risk of using it, it's basically, a question of what is actually happening within these companies and their supply chains to be able to deliver AI products to clients and customers. And what we found is that AI is powered by, an enormous global network of workers, many of whom are doing work at data centers or data annotation tasks, some of them doing content moderation. And the, working conditions of these workers were often, incredibly precarious. People getting paid little more than $1 a day, working under really strenuous conditions, working, 10, 12-hour shifts with little break, with huge amounts of surveillance. And some of the most critical aspects of how AI is produced is actually outsourced to various workers in the global south. So we visited some of these digital sweatshops. The ones in particular that we visited were in East Africa, in Kenya and Uganda. But we know from our colleagues doing similar research that this work is sent all over the world to India, Pakistan, Latin America. Depending on the language of the tech companies, they often send it to, Anglophone Africa or Francophone Africa, for example. So it's a huge industry. It's a global industry that's kind of multi-billion-dollar. And the only way in which a lot of these AI products gets produced is through this kind of outsourcing process. And when you think about it, it very much mirrors the kinds of outsourcing that has happened in manufacturing and in office work as well, where a lot of this work, IT work, was kind of outsourced to first India and then elsewhere around the globe. So when we use AI, it's important that we're aware of this background and of how this kind of global industry of digital sweatshops actually works, because this is basically the tool that powers AI. And the only way in which a lot of these products get produced. In addition to the kind of human element that's going into AI, we also investigated the infrastructural and environmental elements as well. So we visited several data centers. We talked to some engineers, some environmental scientists. And for something like ChatGPT to work, one of these large data centers actually requires the amount of electricity and water from about 80,000 US households. So it's an incredible, drain on a lot of local communities, on the resources that are there. It's really difficult to get precise statistics on how much energy, a particular data center is taking from the grid, or how much water they're taking. But it's basically dependent on, the nature of the grid and the nature of the power that's going in. But we know that there are, a large amount of resources being taken all over the world. And for example, in Iceland, where a lot of our data on the environmental impacts is from, we know that the data centers consume more electricity than the entire households combined. So it's actually, the data center industry is much more prominent in terms of its draw on the grid than data centers in general. Than the entire combined households in general. And so finally, when we started to look at these processes, we realized that there was a much longer history happening here. And that the AI industry wasn't just kind of inventing these practices and inventing these global supply chains. A lot of these, really, the supply chain lines went back to much older colonial patterns. And so part of the book, Feeding the Machine, is really trying to show the continuation of practices of extraction from the global center to the global periphery. And showing how, tech empires are continuing, in many respects, older empires that preceded them. And to do this, we kind of draw on the analogy of the Ugandan railway, which itself, built in the late 19th century, was a kind of technology of the British Empire to extract resources from East Africa. And we noted that, 100 years later, you can see the first fiber optic internet cables being laid in the port of Mombasa in East Africa, which again is a technology of connection, and one that is sold to the local population as something that will bring them wealth and bring them resources. but actually is kind of allowing digital work to be sent there, so it can be used as a point of extraction for the tech empires that are being built today. So just as the kind of Ugandan railways being kind of constructed as a means to, extract resources and take resources out of the country, we really see something very similar with a global digital empire, and the ways in which the connection to networks of technological development is conditioned by basically being a point of extraction. So a lot of the workers we spoke to in Kenya in particular, a lot of these workers wanted to be entrepreneurs themselves. They wanted to start tech companies. They wanted to participate in more meaningful ways in the development of the latest round of digital technology. But really the only possibility of participation in these networks was as a data annotator or someone who kind of coded the data. So we tried to highlight the kind of inequalities in power, inequalities in access to networks and resources that conditioned how this technology was developed. And we thought that this was a kind of meaningful factor that we should consider when we're thinking how useful is this technology for furthering democratic goals.
Thank you, James. So I think if we look behind the curtain, we see a lot of inequalities and a lot of continuities, as James pointed out. So I wonder, Reema, going forward, what can we do? What can the people do to challenge these inequalities? And in particular, how can AI itself be democratized, right? If it's this kind of like central, quite centralized power network, what can we people do to democratize AI? How can we participate in constructing AI? I know you're working on a framework for including public voices in AI, so maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, happy to. It's actually been published already, so I'm going to drop it in the chat. There's also connected to that self-assessment workbook for practitioners to help them think through how to design public engagement and participation on AI. So I will also drop a link to that in the chat after I respond to, I think, two questions you have. One's around inequalities, narrowing and addressing the inequality-based issues that James has been talking about. And then the other one is very much about democratizing AI itself. So in terms of the sort of AI inequalities piece, that's quite a complex and interesting question, because I think this is very much about the inequalities that exist in society. So the inequality of colonialism and the sort of legacies of colonialism are being perpetuated and reinforced by dynamics of power around AI, and we sort of see that when we're even looking at the language. We hear terms like frontier AI, which definitely comes from the sort of colonial playbook. That's quite an interesting question. I think that really the two things are quite connected, aren't they? The question of how you democratize AI and also how you address inequalities. So my answer would be that you can't really address some of these inequalities until you sort of think about who is shaping the direction of travel of AI, including workers, including those who are most impacted by. So that fundamental reset in the power dynamics and that relationship needs to happen to tackle inequalities, and that's always been my position. In terms of how we do that, there's sort of we're very much the sort of the goals and the values of the open source and the civic tech movement that move away from extraction and enclosure-based ideologies and views and values towards common space thinking. So that's a really interesting worldview to enter into when we're thinking about something like AI. So how do we make the mental shift from thinking about AI as something that is about enclosing and extracting and capturing everyone's data, and then perpetuating dominating behaviors in the world, towards actually what does it mean to create civic data cooperatives or civic AI cooperatives and commons? How do we design approaches to developing and governing AI that work and acts in people's interests, and thinking about things like an AI common? I think we barely started on that journey, but that's really what I'm interested in, is there an alternative to the sort of open AI style dominant business models that operate in the way that James has described towards one that is much more inclusive. And that's like an open question as to how we get there. But there are innovations, you know, especially in the sort of data space. People are piloting things like the civic data cooperatives. So Liverpool's established a civic data cooperative, which is very much about agency and control over data generated. It just requires a mindset shift. So you know, there's a kind of, at the moment, a real black box approach. I think we've really highlighted that in terms of the data and information, the approach to AI. We need much more clarity around how AI itself actually works. But also we need much more clarity around the sort of invisibilization of these, you know, impacts on communities, environments, and so on. And I will definitely drop a link now in the chat to these two resources, and be really happy to continue the conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you, Reema. So when we think about how humans have agency with AI, but also over AI, probably to a certain extent, I think it's really important to pay attention to the relationships we are building with AI tools, right? So there are all these romantic AI boyfriend, girlfriend apps out there. There are AI therapists, psychotherapists. So at least the market, the producers of AI try to build these close relationships and really exploit the relationships that we are easily building. But even ourselves, if we don't use these tools, maybe just by using ChatGPT, we tend to anthropomorphize, we tend to understand AI as a person. So James, I'm really curious. I know you're working on the question of human AI relationships and these kind of intimate relationships as well. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about your ongoing research in this direction, and maybe also address the question of AI personhood. If we perceive AI as a person, should AI in democracy get rights? Should there be such a thing as AI citizenship? So to what extent is it a person, or how do we deal with AI personship and the relationships that we're building with them?
It's a great question, Hans, and it is actually the subject of my next book, which will be called Love Machines, which will come out early next year. And it's about people who have relationships with AI in various guises, be that their friend, their intimate partner, their therapist, also imitating their deceased loved one. So it's a emerging kind of field, and I think it happens a lot more than many of us might think. I know that, you know, all of us probably use a bit of AI for kind of work-related tasks, but what I found was that more and more people are actually using AI when it comes to their personal and social life. So asking it questions about feelings, emotions, relationships with people, how should they handle difficult situations, maybe even asking for reassurance or support. And so I think when we think about the role AI will play in the next kind of 10 to 20 years and how that might influence democratic governance, I think a really important question is actually how all of us might come to have much closer relationships to AI, and how that would affect our capacities as individual subjects and as democratic citizens. What happens in a world in which every question kind of gets either fact-checked through or asked through a kind of AI agent that might be your assistant or your helper or something like that. And what happens when a lot of people start to see these as a new kind of social being or a new kind of social entity? And so I will also put something in the chat. It's just a short article I wrote on the BBC a few months ago, which was a kind of starting point for some of this research that I've been doing. So I've interviewed probably over 100 now kind of users and developers of this new brands of products which are selling kind of AI companionship or AI friendship. So think of the Spike Jonze movie Her, with the Scarlett Johansson voiced AI as one example of that kind of possibility. And I think here there are some really interesting things that are starting to develop. So to answer one of Hans's points, no, I don't think AI should have rights or will have rights in the foreseeable future, because I think an important thing to note when we're looking at this is that even if we do anthropomorphize AI, and even if people have what they consider to be meaningful relationships or have some kind of social interaction with AI, there's no ghost in the machine. There's no consciousness, there's no sentience, there's nothing that would warrant us to consider AI as needing or wanting to have rights, because it doesn't want or think anything at all. It is good in the kind of world of AI hype that we live in to remember that it is just a tool. It is just an algorithm. It's just outputting text based on an input and based on a lot of fine-tuning that it's received on how to deliver meaningful and agreeable outputs for its users. So in the book, I kind of, if people said they were in love with AI, I kind of took them at their word, and I just interviewed them and talked, asked them about what their relationship was like. And I think that it's important just to keep in mind that these entities, even if we want to consider them social actors or kind of new kinds of agents, I do think they have a kind of agency that is different from human beings. It's not one that would constitute a rights-based subject, I think. And I there might be a kind of technological leap in 10, 20, 50 years that would change that, but that's not the case with the transformer architecture that's the basis for all of this generation of products or large language models. Despite what some computer scientists in Anthropic and a few other organizations might say, I just think they're crazy to kind of suggest that as a possibility. Like that there's like a 10% chance that it's sentient. It's just I have no idea how you would get to a point where you would even consider thinking something like that. But having said that, the fact that people are kind of having these kinds of relationships does raise really interesting questions. So the first one would be, what kind of forms of dependence or kind of new forms of control or domination could be possible through these things. Because again, you have to look at the corporate structure of the companies that run these. Suddenly, a lot of people will have friends that are essentially entirely, unilaterally controlled by a private company. And, we saw this very interestingly a couple of years ago with one of the main market leaders, a company called Luca, which runs a product called Replica, which is like an AI friend app, where they removed the erotic role play from the app. So they basically stopped the replicas being able to have spicy chat or not safe for work chat with their users because of compliance issues they were having in Italy. And there was like a massive public outcry. People thought that their replicas had been lobotomized, that they had been their best friend had been taken away from them, their wife, well, usually wife, but wife or husband had been kind of completely destroyed. And it kind of highlights how dependent a lot of people can become on this. And it might be, for social relationships, it might be for work kind of stuff, but often what we're seeing is that a lot of these things are blurred, so that people are kind of seeking out these forms of relationships because they don't feel like they have community and love and support in real life. And so they're looking for it somewhere else. And so I think what we see is that this type of product thrives in a world in which we don't have sufficient care networks and institutions that love and care for people in ways that people feel are meaningful. And so it kind of gives rise to this loneliness economy where there's this huge gap in the market, not just for like dating apps, but now increasingly for technological products like AI friends that are trying to fill this loneliness economy. And the very same problems of a kind of misalignment between user interests and corporate interests, which we have already seen in social media, are resurfacing here as well. So the company's interests are to maximize user engagement, to keep you on the app for as long as possible, to allow space for advertising dollars to kind of come in. And of course, the user's interest is to make meaningful relationships and and eventually not to really need to use the app anymore. But of course, that's going to be one of the big issues, I think. So trying to think more about how we can actually regulate and control this new generation of AI products when people are really going to be even more dependent and even more caught up in them. It's kind of like social media on steroids in many respects. And I think we're just seeing the beginning of that now.